to our American Pets Alive Human Animal Support Services webinar. We are so excited for tonight to be featuring Professor Katja Guenther from the University of California, Riverside. She's an associate professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies, and she has written a book that is one of the most important, meaningful, and thorough animal welfare books to be written, particularly at this time in the movement when we are at a pivotal crossroads of creating change and really trying to do things better. And so Professor Guenther's book is very connected to the work we're doing with Human Animal Support Services. So tonight, we get to hear from her on a variety of subjects and learn all about this book. Whether you've read it or not, this will be appropriate for you. And even if you don't have the book, we guarantee you're going to leave here and go order it. So with that, I will welcome you, Professor Guenther, to this call tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen.
So tell us, first of all, a little bit about you. How the heck did you come to write this amazing book?
I came to writing this book in a lot of ways by sort of intellectual and personal accident. It's probably the best way to sum it up. I entered as a volunteer at an animal shelter, a public high intake shelter in the Los Angeles area that in the book I call the Pacific Animal Welfare Center, or PAW. In search of a dog to adopt following the passing of another shelter dog who I'd loved very much. And in the context of that initial encounter with the shelter, it was kind of an eye-opening experience for me, something that I hadn't anticipated because my previous shelter adopted animals had come from outside of Southern California and from shelters that I now know, now that I have a lot more knowledge about the sheltering and animal welfare industries, are kind of the cream of the crop in terms of humane care for animals. So it was really eye-opening when I went to Pacific Animal Welfare Center and saw the incredibly high levels of crowding, the dilapidated conditions, the difficulties that adopters encountered trying to adopt animals from that shelter. And so I decided to sign up to volunteer at that shelter. And it was really the process of volunteering. I'm sure there are many people here today who've had the experience of animal welfare issues kind of taking over your life in a way that maybe you didn't expect at the moment where you first agreed to foster a dog or to volunteer at an animal shelter. And it's sort of the same story for me. But what I observed in the shelter dovetailed so much with a lot of my previous intellectual interests. I've done a lot of research, especially on issues of power and resistance, particularly in the context of feminist organizing and organizing involving women. And in the shelter, it was very apparent to me very quickly that a lot of issues that I considered important topics for research were kind of playing out before me in ways that hadn't been investigated previously in the social science literature, on any range of institutions, not just animal shelters. So because of that, I decided this needed to be not just an opportunity for volunteering, but also a place to conduct field work. And I started conducting field work and did that for 3 years at PAW, really trying to observe closely what was happening, both in terms of members of the public who came into the shelter, also how the staff and the volunteers and the members of the public interacted with each other, which for a number of reasons that we might have some time to talk about today involved a high level of conflict. And also what the experience was like for animals. And interestingly, as I learned, as I did more and more background research into animal sheltering, there's actually very little research done on the perspective of animals within animal shelters. And so that was a key part that I wanted to bring to light, and also aligned with my general philosophy as someone who does feminist ethnographic research, to pay attention to populations that we don't always hear from in our mainstream conversations.
So tell us, can you give us sort of an overview of, the book covers so much ground, but can you give us just an overview of what is the book about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm imagining in the audience we have some people who maybe have read the book, but probably a lot haven't. So I might just take a couple of minutes here to talk about some of the key themes so that we all have some shared starting ground for this conversation. But The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals is really a book about the social worlds of shelter animals. In so many different ways, the animal shelters are really microcosms of our broader society. And in the field work that I conducted at PA, I just discovered so many parallels between really central concerns, both in academic circles, which are, a lot of the circles that I travel in, but also in terms of our public conversations and our public debates. Some of those issues, I think, include things like why we're so committed in the United States to caging as a practice, not just for people, but also for animals. And what does it mean and what does it say about us that we have this commitment to confinement and caging and carceral responses to bodies, whether they're animal or human, that we think of as being out of place? What role, if any, should police and other agents of government surveillance and intervention be playing in communities? And that includes government agencies like animal control agencies. What are the many guises of white supremacy, and how are sexism, classism, ableism, and speciesism used to prop up white supremacy in a lot of different ways? In the book, I also explore issues of grieving and what lives we consider to be worth grieving, and how we make lives that our society doesn't currently see as matter, right? That deserve to be mourned and deserve to be acknowledged. And the book also deals with big questions about how we try to move forward and build solidarity, or at least understanding, if we can't accomplish solidarity, between groups that are divided by longstanding social cleavages. So as I said in the book, I engage in an ethnography of this shelter in Los Angeles area that I call PAW, or the Pacific Animal Welfare Center. Ethnography is a qualitative research approach that involves the really deep immersion of the researcher in the research setting, in part in an effort to understand and analyze the experiences of the research setting from the perspectives of those who are in it. So in my work, I focused especially on the perspectives of two groups that are generally omitted from literature on animal shelters, even though they're very key players in animal shelter environments, namely volunteers and impounded animals. And of course, the book also addresses and deals with staff and management issues, but because there's been a great deal more written already about management and staff issues, I wanted to especially make sure that there was attention paid to volunteers and animals and their experiences in this environment. And what I wanted to try to understand better through my research were really a set of these interconnected issues, including why so many animals at that time were coming into the shelter, what determined which of those animals left the shelter alive, and also why the shelter seemed to have such a high level of conflict, because I observed just an immense amount of conflict between different actors in the shelter environment. And what I really uncovered through my fieldwork at PAW is that social inequalities of race, class, gender, ability, species, and breed are really central for explaining and understanding why animals come into shelters, and also why shelters like PAW kill some of them. And I'm going to just read, if I may, just one paragraph, actually a couple sentences from the book, from the introduction, that I think sum up a lot of the key ideas or themes that I'm grappling with in the book. So I write that the existence and reproduction of social inequalities, the use of state power to enforce behavioral norms on lower income and non-white citizens, competing discourses and ideologies about animal sheltering, animal welfare, and what constitutes humane treatment, government policies and practices, and the growing move towards the privatization of public shelters all help shape which animals end up in shelters and what they will experience once they get there. What happens at PAW, including human struggles over how animals at PAW live and if they die, is the outcome of everyday and sustained collisions of capitalism, of anthroparchy, which is a term to refer to the social structure of human domination over non-human animals, white supremacy, and patriarchy. These collisions reduce companion animals to expendable commodities. They lace our our views about which shelter animals deserve saving with ideas about race, class, gender, and ability. And they ultimately allowed the shelter to shift responsibility for the killing of shelter animals onto the low-income minority community the shelter purports to serve, and onto the animals themselves. So just to provide a little bit more background about the shelter environment itself, when I started field work, PAW, which is one of several shelters in a multi-shelter public system, was receiving about 20,000 live animals each year. The live release rate for dogs was about 55%, and the live release rate for cats was less than a third of that when I started my field work. The physical buildings of PAW had been built in the early 1950s, and by the time I came along were in what I would describe as a state of extreme decay. PAW's service area covers about a dozen towns and also unincorporated areas with about 500,000 people who are human residents. And compared to the rest of the region, and remember that this is Southern California, which is in and of itself a highly diverse region, ethnically, racially, economically, but even compared to the city of Los Angeles and other surrounding counties, this area is disproportionately low income, non-English speaking, and newer immigrants coming primarily from Mexico, Central America, China, and Vietnam. Even though the communities are poor, like all of Los Angeles County and the area, the housing prices are extremely high, and that's certainly one issue the shelter had to deal with indirectly as well. The average home price in that area is over $500,000. Within the shelter, these so-called people who are characterized by shelter staff and also by volunteers as irresponsible owners are the people who are seen as being the people who cause such a high number of intakes. But one of the early chapters of the book, which I call the myth of the irresponsible owner, specifically tackles the idea that there is this group of individuals who are lower income, generally people of color, who engage in a set of animal practices that don't align with white middle-class expectations of how people are supposed to take care of their animals. What I found in my research and interacting with these people for many years at the shelter is that those people whose animals ended up at the shelter, whether as owner surrenders or as strays and they came in to try to reclaim them, typically made very significant efforts to keep their animals with them, but they really faced a wide range of hurdles stemming from poverty and precarity, including things like lack of funds for basic care, let alone money for major vet emergencies, housing problems, which were a leading cause of animal surrender, including losing homes altogether, and high levels of policing, both by the human police and also by the animal control agency itself, that meant that these people were disproportionately likely to be arrested and put in jail, even for relatively minor offenses, to be deported from the United States, or most commonly to be cited by animal control officers themselves for having an unlicensed animal or an animal who was unsterilized or unvaccinated. And those licensing fees and the citation costs were simply costs that these people couldn't afford. So what I really saw through my fieldwork at PAW and my analysis there is that animal shelters are nested into bigger structures of social inequality that really cause both the work of animal shelters to need to happen in the first place and also make it a lot harder for us to ever get to a zero intake world. And I'm inherently optimistic about animal welfare and really believe that there is a way for us to get there to a place where we no longer have a need for animal shelters. So in the book, I address a wide range of other themes, including how PAW deals with and reflects broader and deeper long-term social issues. The case of pit bulls, which Kristen and I might have more time to talk about in our conversation as well, is one example that's very, very powerful. A place to look for the ways in which race and class and gender intersect with one another to harm not only individual humans, but also to harm groups of humans and also to harm groups of animals, specifically the dogs who are identified in a shelter like PAW as being pit bulls. So ultimately, what I really see as kind of the most important takeaway from the book is that if we want to improve outcomes both for people and for animals who come into contact with shelters, but also for people and animals who don't come into contact with shelters. And I think that's a population that needs to be included in conversations about animal sheltering. We really have to commit to a broader platform of multi-species social justice. And social justice broadly refers to, political philosophy that centers on ensuring that all people in a society have equal access to political, social, and economic opportunities, and that there's really careful attention paid to the distribution of those rights and opportunities. And it's kind of an umbrella term because it encompasses work that's being done against racism, against sexism and misogyny and homophobia and transphobia, and also against class domination. But it doesn't typically right now include any attention to justice for animals, nor consideration of how human-animal relationships and the disruption of those relationships can in fact be a form of violence against communities and disproportionately impacts poor people and people of color in the US. So my hope in writing the book is really that people who identify as caring about animals, but maybe who right now don't identify necessarily as caring about racism or classism or sexism, can come to the book and finish reading it, having a better appreciation for how our human social worlds are deeply connected and intertwined with the worlds of companion animals, and in fact with the worlds of non-companion animals as well. And I think we really need to ask ourselves a lot of tough questions, like how we can promote diversity and inclusion in animal shelters when we're using carceral logics, that is political commitment to caging, to organize our work in sheltering. That is fundamentally at odds with an anti-racist platform. And likewise, I think that a significant amount of work needs to happen within activist communities that are focused on racism and sexism and environmental justice to recognize and incorporate animal rights as deeply and inextricably tied to the goals of those movements as well. So it's a book, I think today I'm speaking primarily to the people who are more interested in animal issues, but it's also a book that I hope will reach people who are engaged in various types of social justice work centered on people, so that they too can recognize the ways in which they would enrich their own work by incorporating attention to animals and human-animal relationships.
So I want to go right to a heavy question, which is that I've gotten to read the book a couple of times now, and I think that I keep coming back to this idea you present of that shelters are simultaneously helping, policing, and killing animals, and that is very structural. They feel strongly about that's very structural. Can you talk about how we might change that in order to change what is actually happening in the animal shelters?
Yeah, I can certainly try to. The nexus of helping, policing, and killing is really the focus of the second chapter in the book. And most shelters in the United States right now, with the exception of a very few that are truly no kill, so not shelters where only 10% of animals are being killed, but where really no animals are being killed unless it's for severe medical veterinary reasons. They operate with three contradictory functions that really work to legitimate and disguise each other. And this creates a set of contradictions within animal shelters that's really hard for any institution type to try to overcome, because in a lot of ways they complement each other, but in many ways they also are totally at odds with one another. So when I talk about helping in the context of animal shelters, that refers to the different ways that shelters are providing care for unhoused animals, but also the different services that they might provide to people in their communities, whether that's people coming in to adopt animals or people looking for low-cost or free vaccine clinics, right, or whatever the different services might be. Policing refers to the many ways in which animal shelters engage in surveillance of animals and people, both in the community, but also in the shelter itself. And I think when we tend to think about policing and animal control, we tend to think more of policing out in the field, what animal control officers are doing in the field. But the staff in animal shelters, and sometimes also the volunteers, are engaged in constant surveillance and policing of the animals who are in their care as well. And in fact, that policing is often seen as being part of that work of caring for the animals. And then, of course, killing is perhaps the most narrow and in some ways easiest, even if it's the hardest to talk about, to understand, because it really just involves the decisions that are made in shelters about which animal lives to end, and then carrying out those decisions. But what happens in animal shelters like PAW is we see these complex interactions where, for example, killing is explained away or justified by claims about policing and helping. So it was very routine. The most common explanations that the shelter staff would provide for why a particular animal was killed at the shelter was usually something related to a health-based claim. So this animal was suffering, they had an upper respiratory infection, it wasn't getting better, so we had to kill them. And we did that both because they were suffering, but also because we had to protect the health of the other animals that are in our facility. So this is about both policing the body of that particular animal who's been identified as disabled, but it's also a logic that rests on helping, alleviating the suffering of that particular animal, but also trying to alleviate potential future suffering of other animals who are at the shelter at the same time. For dogs, the very dominant, maybe not the most dominant, but a very dominant explanation focused on public safety and ideas that a particular animal wasn't safe for placement or had exhibited some type of problematic behavior. Oh, he tried to snap at a kennel attendant yesterday. We don't think he's safe to place anymore. And again, that is a type of policing, obviously, of that particular animal's behavior in a very powerful and punitive way. But it's also framed through a discourse of protecting public safety, which is this helping idea again. And animal shelters were really founded in the United States with a greater emphasis on killing, right? That's the original starting point of animal sheltering in the US, where we know from even the late 1800s with the founding of New York's Animal Control Agency that over 95% of animals that came into the care of that system ended up dead. And now only more recently have we started adding on this attention to helping. And so I think we really see some deep inherent contradictions that we're often really uncomfortable about talking about in the animal sheltering industry. And when we do talk about them, they tend to be conversations in which people become very emotional very quickly. And so I think part of the work that we need to do in the animal welfare industry is really have more honest and open and challenging conversations, both on an individual basis, but also within the industry, as a whole, at conferences, in, industry publications, different kinds of venues where this could take place. For people to have the opportunity to talk about and listen to the impacts of these contradictory systems on their own work and also on their own worldviews and how they approach the work that they do in animal shelters. And ultimately to really make a firm commitment to what kind of facility they want to be working with or working in or managing or directing. And if people say, I'm now the manager of this shelter, we're not going to kill animals here anymore, that can happen, in the vast majority of cases. And there's so many resources available right now in the United States, including, Maddie's Fund and other organizations, the ASPCA, who are grant-making institutions that can provide the kinds of resources even to, traditionally underfunded public shelters to really get them moving in that pathway. But I think that commitment, is an important and big first step in those conversations as well.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about the dogs in the book, because you tie all of this to very particular stories of Monster and the other dogs. And I saw a comment in the chat sort of saying, I'm so sorry for the dogs you had to lose. And I think that really resonated with me because those dogs could have been any dogs. They're dogs in the shelters that I've run. Can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to tell those stories and you felt like it was important as part of the whole story of this?
Just so I can make sure that I understand your question, you're asking about why I included the stories of various dogs in the book. Yeah, a couple of reasons. I think the most important one is that, you know, part of my initial commitment in doing this work is that I wanted to include the perspectives of all of the actors who are in this institutional setting, and that included the dogs who disappeared, the dogs who died. And one such dog opens and closes the book. For those who've read it will know about the pit bull named Monster. A number of people have asked me if he's actually the dog on the cover of the book, but this is actually another dog who's living a very happy and probably very comfortable life in Beverly Hills right now. So you don't have to worry about the about the cover image dog. But Monster was a dog who looked very similarly and who unfortunately did not leave the shelter alive, and in fact was never made available for adoption. And including the stories of these dogs, I think it's important for people to understand what the real experience is of being in these environments. There is an emotional cost, and I've heard from some readers, including some very good friends of mine, that, you know, that they bought the book, or in some cases I gave them the book, but they haven't been able to read it because they're worried it's going to be too sad. And it certainly was not my intention for the book to be too sad, and I myself don't interpret it as being a sad book. But it does have to acknowledge the experiences of these animals whose lives otherwise disappear. And part of this is the project that I talk about in one of the book chapters about how volunteers, through their different practices of grieving and memorializing animals who were killed in animal shelters, like PAW, the Pacific Animal Welfare Center, how they're engaged in a political project in resisting the shelters and the broader society's acceptance of shelter killing as a so-called solution to the problem of unhoused companion animals in the United States. So bringing these animal stories into the book is also in part an act of memorializing them for me. I certainly did not write about every dog I knew at this shelter who died. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of them. If I sat down and tried to make an exhaustive list, it would be hard to do, but it would be long. But for those, to select some cases to really understand what happened to those particular animals and to analyze what happened to those particular animals, both in the interest of remembering those particular animals and bringing their experiences to bear on our conversations and discussions about animal welfare, but also to really take apart and look at what happened to them so we can try to understand it and hopefully make sure or work towards preventing it from happening again in the future.
So as I'm sitting here listening, I'm thinking about the shelter leadership, shelter staff that are on here, and really feel like they're trying their best. They're doing what they can, and that you might be taking an overly sympathetic approach to volunteers. But I want to just ask you, because I feel like you really turn a critical lens on the whole thing. Everything sort of gets viewed through this lens of asking hard questions. How did that play out when it came to volunteers? What hard questions did you sort of ask in the book?
Yeah, my hard questions about volunteers was really focused on volunteer staff relationships, which at this particular shelter, and I now know from the feedback that I've been getting over email from so many people who've read the book who've either volunteered or worked in shelters, seems to resonate across a lot of different shelters in the United States. They had really conflictual relationships. They came at the shelter from different social locations outside of the shelter. So overwhelmingly, the staff, including what I would classify as sort of middle management, and also the kennel attendants and animal control officers who did kind of the day-to-day routine work at the shelter, were overwhelmingly people with high school or sometimes some community college background as their education. They were overwhelmingly Latinx. In the time that I was at the shelter, there were, I think, 2 people who were middle management or regular staff who I could remember who were white. Almost everybody else was Latinx, a smattering of Black staff members as well. And they were earning incomes that sort of left them scratching at sort of the top of the working class tier. Whereas the volunteers that came into the shelter were almost entirely women. They were overwhelmingly white, with a handful of Latinx and Asian women as well. Overwhelmingly people who belonged to what we call in sociology the creative classes, so people who were engaged in a lot of Hollywood, often related work, where they had a lot of control over their own time. So they were people who could come to a shelter on a Tuesday afternoon and volunteer for 5 or 6 hours on a Tuesday. So they were people who brought a lot of privilege and a lot of power in many ways into the shelter environment. And they were engaged in an almost constant set of negotiations with the shelter staff, including sometimes the manager, the general manager, but most often not with that specific person, but rather with underlings, about trying to get more time for specific animals. And in that way, they were trying to assert a worldview that they brought into the shelter, that this shelter should not be killing animals. And one of the interesting things that for me came out of this work is that in the social science literature on volunteerism, the overall emphasis, and also culturally in our discourses in thinking about volunteerism, is this idea that people volunteer with organizations because they support the work that organization is doing, right? And they want to contribute to that particular work. At PAW, that wasn't the case at all. Women came to the shelter to volunteer because they wanted to help the animals, but almost all of them were actually opposed to how the shelter itself operated. So they came in with a very different set of ideas about how animals should be treated, how long animals should be given before they could be adopted, until they were adopted, what kinds of reasons were actually acceptable reasons for killing animals at the shelter. Whereas the staff, many of them had started in these jobs coming straight out of high school. I know at least one manager who literally worked their way up a career ladder starting at age 18 to become a longtime manager within this particular shelter and shelter system. And over a period of decades, they acquire a set of knowledges that's based on their experiences working in the field, but also within a culture of animal control that until very recently has been deeply committed to and has widely accepted, if not embraced, the practice of tight confinement, punitive approaches to dealing with the public, and killing of animals as appropriate and normal and responsible ways to go about the practice of animal control. So you really ended up at PAW with two very different groups, different in terms of their race, class, education, also then different in terms of their beliefs about what the shelter should be doing and how they should be doing it. And ultimately what that meant too for these negotiations about specific animals and their fates and if and when they would be killed were about struggles between individuals where there was a lot of tension around issues of race and class. In the book I detail, and I'm not going to talk about them all here, but I detail a lot of the different different strategies, I should say, that volunteers used to kind of assert that their knowledge was actually better or superior to the knowledge that the staff members had. And that was really difficult for the staff to accept. Their reaction often, and I heard them say this sometimes when maybe they weren't aware I was there, was some uppity white lady is coming in here and telling me how to do my job. And that was a very common response. And, as a college professor, one I can empathize with, women faculty and people of color who are faculty all the time deal with students who challenge our knowledge disproportionately more than they challenge the knowledge of white professors who are men. So we see this in all kinds of different social settings, but we don't tend to really talk about it or think about it in the context of animal sheltering and how people are using different dynamics of power and control that they might have. These women volunteers, for instance, threatening lawsuits, sometimes actually filing lawsuits against this particular shelter, threatening, and in at least a few instances that I know of, creating viral social media campaigns that were really damaging to the reputation of the shelter. And so that was a really, contradictory and conflictual environment, but where a lot of those conflicts that seemed like they were just about somebody having an emotional connection maybe to one animal were really about the assertion of white views about animal care as more valuable and more important than those of the predominantly non-white staff members who worked there. So I hope that answered your question, at least a little. There's so much going on in that part of the book.
It's like if one word describes this book, it's conflict and I guess resistance. And so you talk a lot about the conflictual relationships, but you also talk about resistance on the part of animals. And can you talk a little bit about how you maybe reframe our discourse around behavior as actually actively resisting the system?
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked on a chapter in the book that focuses specifically on animal resistance, and really work on challenging the idea that's so dominant, not just in animal shelters, but also in our broader culture, that animals can't engage in meaningful or purposeful action. Right, and the dominant view within animal shelters is really that everything animals do is kind of based on a behavioral model of sort of conditioned responses to stimuli. And there's so much fascinating work now that has been done and is continuing to be done on animal cognition. But that knowledge, by and large, at least as I observed in PAW, doesn't translate over into the actual practices of that particular animal shelter, and I suspect not into the practices of very many animal shelters. And so what I really wanted to look at in that chapter was the different ways in which animals demonstrate how they are acting as agents, as individuals who are choosing whether or not they're going to comply with human expectations, particularly in the shelter setting, of their behavior, of their appearance, of all sort of the routine interactions that they have with humans. And in the shelter environment, the shelter tends to respond, at least at PAW, to the same way that we respond to resistance in people. We tend to police it and also to pathologize it. We've seen a lot of that happen in our media over the last 7 or 8 months around Black Lives Matter protests, for example. In the shelter environment, the staff view animals' acts of resistance as pathologies, usually defining animals as either suffering from aggression, which becomes like this broad category of psychopathology, both within cats and within dogs, or is suffering from zoochosis, or the idea that they've basically been driven crazy by the shelter environment. Aggression is really seen as a fixed characteristic, as something that can't really be changed in the animal at PAW, whereas zoochosis is something that's context specific, but ironically PAW's solution to zoochosis, even though presumably if the shelter is making an animal crazy, leaving the shelter would be the cure, right, for that particular ailment, their response instead is to kill that animal because the zoochosis is interpreted as an indicator of some kind of weak constitution that will make that animal an unsuitable or inappropriate companion outside of the shelter. Cats have a particularly difficult time. They're basically subjected to a single instance of sort of a handling and evaluation, usually by a kennel attendant, who determines whether or not that cat responds to them by hissing, scratching, arching their back. And if they do any of those things, that cat is designated as a so-called feral cat and is not made available for adoption and is put to death on the first available legal date that it can be. So this is not a shelter that had, at the time I was doing field work there, any kind of a TNR policy. So ultimately, the tragedy of the situation is that animals who engage in resistance may be making a noble effort, but it's an effort that actually ends up costing them their lives. There's certain types of behaviors, resistant behaviors, like pancaking, so refusing to walk, for example, when taking a dog out of the kennel, that sometimes volunteers or staff will be more forgiving of. But animals who engaged in incessant barking or so-called pogo sticking, jumping at their kennel doors, would be identified as animals that were zoochotic or aggressive, animals who engaged in any perceived attempt at biting staff or volunteers or members of the public who routinely come in and actually stick their hands into the kennels, and then when they're bit are quite startled and run up to the front desk and report vicious dogs out there in the kennels. But I really wanted to, in this chapter, think about how those actions that we view as indicators of stress or of confinement may actually be potentially interpretable as deliberate strategies on the parts of these animals to reject the circumstances of their confinement in this facility and to reject anthroparchy, or the human domination of animals. So it was really about just shifting our perspective, if even for just one chapter of one book, to think about animals acting in a different way, and in a way that is purposeful and meaningful for them, rather than something that's merely reactive.
And so we have a lot of questions just coming in, and I just want to touch on a couple of them. So do you believe that there is a role for medical / behavioral euthanasia for extreme cases? Or are you essentially thinking that, or asserting that every animal is virtually every animal is savable?
I think virtually every animal is savable. I do talk in the book about at least one case that I was obviously not the decision maker. I wasn't a staff member there, but that I was aware of a German Shepherd that entered the shelter, a senior animal in giving signs of extreme physical distress. And there was a kennel attendant who was distressed observing that animal, and who was distressed because she wanted to recommend to her supervisor that the animal be authorized for immediate emergency euthanasia. And I kind of, said to her as we were sitting together outside this dog's kennel, I think you're doing the right thing. You're telling your supervisor this is not making it happen. It's alerting somebody else who can bring in additional expertise and is going to bring an RVT over here and a vet, to make a decision about what is ideal for this animal. But if it hadn't happened there, that animal, I think, would have probably maybe lived another half day or day in some state of discomfort, or it would have been sent to a so-called outside veterinarian, so put into an animal control vehicle in one of those small confined, kennel boxes on the kinds of trucks that PAW uses, and then driven down a series of extremely bumpy, pothole-ridden roads to a vet that's about 25 to 30 minutes away. That doesn't seem like a humane, situation. It's not what I would want at the end of my life, necessarily. So I do think that there are circumstances when appropriate steps are taken and people with relevant knowledge are able to weigh in on them. And that was one of the challenges at PAW, is that there were no RVTs there, other than during an 8-hour shift during daytime hours. So if animals came in overnight, it was staff members who had to make decisions about emergency euthanasia, not people that actually have veterinary background and knowledge. So I think that's problematic. And in terms of behavior, I can't say definitively what would have happened in the case of any particular animal at PAW, but what I can say is that part of my experience doing field work inevitably led me to be a foster. And I fostered dozens of dogs from this shelter and also from some of the other shelters that are part of the same shelter system. Almost all of them were adult pit bulls, which is the least desirable or wanted category of dog. And a lot of those animals came into my home with a range of behavioral issues, including one dog who growled and snarled at every person that she met except for me and my partner, which took time, but we got there, and who was also extremely aggressive towards our dogs at the time of their first sighting. And it took us about 3 months to be able to safely integrate her so she could be around our other dogs. She went on to be adopted into an immensely loving home, where she was loved and cared for, and she had a great existence until she sadly died younger than expected of cardiac problems. But I think having those experiences, and anyone who's fostered animals probably will have similar stories of animals that are challenging to work with, but realizing that if there are people who are willing to put in the energy and the space and give the time that those animals need, that most of them can in fact find homes that are suitable for them.
So we talked a little bit about at the beginning about this, but I want to circle back to it because I think I don't want to miss one of the most important parts of the book, that animal shelters are caught up in large structural inequality and in larger systems of racism, classism, and other forms of power. Can you talk about sort of why that matters and how that might lead us to a different approach to fixing the problems of animal shelters?
Yeah, absolutely. Animal shelters are caught up in so many different ways in these bigger structures of social inequalities. And I think part of this is even just acknowledging the history of the animal sheltering movement, that it originated in the mid to late 1800s in the United States as an outcome of the work of highly affluent white Americans who used moral frameworks primarily based in Christian teaching as a way to appeal mainly to other affluent white Americans to fund animal control services, to police poor and immigrant communities, both white and black at that time, right? Irish Americans and Italian Americans and their animals were targeted along with those of Black Americans and other people of color. And I think we need to acknowledge that history exists within animal sheltering, and that a lot of the early logics that developed during that time, especially these approaches of kind of embracing punitive models of animal control, stay with us in different versions today. And I think we also have to look at the different ways in which our own beliefs and dialogues about particular types of animals who come into animal shelters and the people who we think those animals belong to or may have belonged to are tied up in systems of inequality as well. And I devote in the book an entire chapter to talking about what I call the peculiar problem of pit bulls, who everyone here who's involved in animal sheltering knows are significantly overrepresented among animals who come into animal shelters. And fortunately, over the last 10 or 15 years, there are a lot of ways in which pit bulls have become more accepted. They've become more mainstream in the United States, and that's helped animal shelters and the industry as a whole lower the percentage of these dogs who are being killed. But they continue to be tied up in deeply held cultural and social beliefs that we have that connect pit bulls specifically to Black masculinity, and where we view both pit bulls and Black men as groups of people or animals who are violent, who are unpredictable, who pose a potential threat to public safety, and who need unique types of management in order for them to be successful and assimilated parts of our society. And part of the work that I did specifically on pit bulls also took me into the world of rescue here in the Los Angeles area, where overwhelmingly the people who are doing pit bull rescue are middle and upper class white women, people who simply because of their own sort of position in social hierarchies are uniquely well positioned to remarket pit bulls as appealing to white people, as feminine, as opposed to associated with masculinity, and to kind of class them up or give them this potential of upward social mobility. But they do that in ways where they impose the expectations of white companion animals on pit bulls and kind of save the dogs, individual dogs, but without actually ever challenging the underlying ideas about race in the United States and the racialization of this particular group of dogs that is part of what causes so many of these dogs to be in the shelter in the first place, and also results in people continuing to have more negative or fearful attitudes towards these particular dogs. So I think it's important for us to think about different categories of animals along with different categories of people, to explore and critically analyze the kinds of relationships that exist between them, and to really interrogate those so that we can work more effectively, not only to help individual animals or to make our data look better in terms of live release rates, but to actually be contributing as well to broader projects of undermining white supremacist, types of practices in a dominant white culture.
So you lay out a vision that is, so closely aligned with human animal support services and the other work of American Pets Alive. And I just want to understand a little bit. I mean, when I first read it, I thought, well, this is really big. I don't know if this is really possible, but the more I think about it, the more I think, well, we can't improve things unless we actually reimagine what's possible. So can you talk about your very expansive vision for the future and how things could change?
Yeah, absolutely. I conclude the book with returning to Monster, the dog who opened the book, and with what I consider a utopian vision. And utopias, are meant to be understood somewhat as fantasy, but also I hope as ideals, right? As things that we hope on some level we can learn something from to actually try to achieve. And in the new world that I imagine for Monster and for all companion animals and all animals in general in the United States and the world is a vision where animals are decommodified and where animals have the agency, they have the right or the ability to choose which humans they want to be attached to, rather than us as humans always putting ourselves in the position of control and power over animals. And really radically redesigning and reimagining our communities so that companion animals can move freely between households at their own will and choosing to spend time with different individual people or different groups of people across different households. And of course, this would require, a really radical kind of restructuring. I think it's actually in Phoenix right now that they're building what's going to be the first car-free community. You might know more about that, Kristen, as a recent transplant out of Arizona than I do, so I've only read about this a little bit. But even just thinking, right now, part of why we consider animals on the street to be animals out of place and animals who require intervention is because we fear that they're going to get hit by cars, right? But if we had a world in which we weren't dependent on this kind of vehicular transportation, or in which we built overpasses or other systems, which I'm confident canines for sure would be smart enough to use to avoid roadways and to be able to move freely, it would really shift our entire way of interacting with and negotiating and incorporating animals. And it would be much more democratic, both for humans and for animals. It wouldn't give any one human necessarily this best friend relationship that we currently claim we have with dogs and cats, even though so many of them are also ending up in shelters. But it would create new opportunities for us to forge different networks of interdependence and of caregiving that I think would also have tremendously significant benefits for the humans that participated in the networks of care for a particular animal. So when I laid out this kind of utopian vision at the conclusion of the book, I have to acknowledge this isn't something that's going to happen next week. And it might not be something that happens ever, but I think part of what's really useful about utopian visioning is that it points us in directions that help us identify what our priorities are and what the underlying logics for how we want to organize our practices and our policies and our own ideologies are as well. And so that then, leads to a whole series for me in the book of recommendations for building what I would call humane communities, which include, among other things, shelters that have very clear policies of incorporating members of their local communities on some type of an oversight committee or oversight board or board of managers, so that there is actual community participation in developing shelter programs and providing feedback into shelters. Right now, the vast majority of public animal shelters don't have any kind, certainly here in the LA area, any kind of mechanism other than calling an 800 number complaint line, that's pasted on the wall to share what their feedback and ideas are about how shelters are operating. There's been fascinating work done by Eva Meyer and others about the possibilities for including animal voices themselves in democratic decision-making. And so that's another suggestion that I make in the book, is that we need to find ways of incorporating the experiences and the desires of what animals are communicating to us. And animals, we often talk about them as voiceless, but they're not voiceless. It's just we don't want to hear them. And that is part of anthroparchy, of human domination of animals, is our refusal to pay attention to and listen to what animals are communicating. But if there's one thing that I learned on a personal level from conducting this field work is that you can learn from animals so very much. And if we just listen to animals and try to understand animals and what they're saying to us, we can bring them into making decisions about animal welfare concerns, both in shelters, but also in other areas of animal-human conflict or negotiation.
So we have so many questions and we're out of time, and I'm wondering, close to out of time, and I'm wondering, would you consider coming back for another session like this, or coming onto one of the Monday calls so that people can actually, I think there's some really important questions that would be worthwhile for the group. Could we convince you into talking with us again?
I would be more than happy to. I'm seeing some of the questions in the chat. I don't actually have I can't see the Q&A, so I apologize.
It's a whole nother hour of conversation.
Okay.
Really question. So what we'll do is, I think, Rory, just give me a thumbs up if we can do this, but I think when we send out a follow-up, we'll figure out the next time we get to talk to Professor Guenther. And I think if you're working in animal welfare and you're sitting here thinking, okay, a couple things. This project took place in a shelter where the life-saving rate was below 50%, a really tough shelter. And that may not be your reality, but unfortunately it is the reality still in so many big shelters in these states where the euthanasia rate is still very high. And if you're sort of sitting thinking, okay, but really, how do we change things? I think that what the book did for me is it helped me. I've been working in this industry for more than a decade, and it really helped me just rethink critically about things I really had taken for granted, and made me think that how could we rethink what we do in the future and make it better. So Dr. Guenther, in closing, I want to ask you, what did you hope the animal welfare world would hear from your writing of this book?
If I'm allowed to sneak in two things in our remaining 2 minutes, I think the two things that I really wanted the animal welfare community to hear was recognition of animals' voices in the book itself, and hopefully creating ways through the way the book is presented and written for members of the animal welfare community, whether they're volunteers or staff members or donors or whoever they may be, to really think differently about their own capacity or investment in listening to what animals are trying to tell us about their experiences. And as part of that, to maybe move away from what we sometimes impose as our ideas about what is in an animal's best interest. Because we do have, through our anthropological beliefs and our own ability to make better decisions for animals than they can make for themselves, some problematic embedded ideas as well. And I hope that the book shifts that. The other piece I mentioned kind of in some of my one of my comments earlier in our conversation this evening, which is really my hope that individuals who are engaged in animal welfare will be better able to see the many different ways in which animal experiences, and especially the experiences of shelter animals, can't be taken out of the context of our broader social worlds. And I say this is a book about the social worlds of animal shelters and the social worlds of shelter animals as well. And if we try to separate out animal sheltering from issues related to economic inequality and racial inequality, and especially in regards to volunteering as well, gender inequality, because it's a national trend that women are grossly overrepresented among people who volunteer, both in animal rescue and in animal sheltering, we're missing big parts of the picture. And kind of talking about things like, I know that the timing of the book has been kind of interesting because I didn't know when I wrote this last year, about all the changes that would happen as an outcome and part of the Black Lives Matter uprisings and the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other Black Americans by the police. But we're hearing so much more conversation, I think, across a lot of industries, including the university where I am, about inclusion. But I think we need to push ourselves to go beyond just talking about inclusion, to think about justice. And justice is harder. It's a lot harder than inclusion. It's one thing to lower barriers to make it easier for people from diverse backgrounds to apply for and get jobs at your animal shelter. But it's completely another thing to challenge the underlying logics at your shelter that mirror the underlying logics of white supremacy, like, for example, caging and the death penalty. So I think we need to engage more deeply with a lot of those conversations and issues, and hopefully as part of that also find ways to bring people in the animal welfare industry into conversations with groups that are working on anti-racism, on feminist goals, and on other social justice causes, to recognize, a broader program or commitment to multi-species justice.
Thank you so much. And again, we want to get all of your questions answered. So we're going to make sure that they do get answered. And if you can't join us next time, we'll get the recording to you because your questions are great. And we're so really honored that people came tonight. And, it's this particular moment in the animal welfare movement where we're just expanding our thinking and being challenged. And I said to everyone at the beginning of when this book first came out, it will definitely challenge your thinking. And I think it has done that for so many of us. So Dr. Guenther, thank you so much for just diving in and spending so much time. This is the third time that we've gotten to speak with you, and your time is so appreciated by all of us. You've at this point talked to more than 500 people who work in animal welfare, which is just so exciting.
I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk with so many people doing this work, and I'm really happy to engage in conversation with people, both through these formal processes, but also in other contexts. So feel free to reach out or be in touch.
Thank you so much.
To everyone here.
And thanks to everybody for coming to our American Pets Live Human Animal Support Services webinar. Please check out the Human Animal Support Services website and on Facebook if you haven't already. So much of the future that we hope for is also described in Dr. Guenther's book. So thanks, and everybody have a great night. We will see you back here for our next webinar next Thursday. It is on building programs based on intake data, and that'll be myself and Dr. Jefferson talking about how we can do better when it comes to intake management. So thanks everybody, and have a great night.